For the first time in U.S. history, the government is taking responsibility for forcing indigenous children into boarding schools. The practice took place for more than 150 years, and it's part of American history that's not often discussed. But today, President Biden said that's changing.
Lost generations, culture and language, lost trust. It's horribly, horribly wrong. It's a sin on our soul. The federal government has never formally apologized for what happened until today. I formally apologize as President of the United States of America for what we did.
Here's a look back at just how detrimental these boarding schools really were. For generations, thousands of Native American children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in boarding schools operated by the federal government. It began with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of 1819 and the Peace Policy of 1869. The goal was to assimilate the children into mainstream settler American culture, but in the process, they lost their own.
Their hair that they were told was sacred was chopped off. Their names literally erased, replaced by a number or an English name.
The federal government is now acknowledging the children were subjected to harsh conditions and suffered physical, sexual, and cultural abuse. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages and practicing their traditions, which led to generations of children being cut off from their native identities. The U.S. operated more than 500 institutions across the country. The purpose was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. The impact of these policies led to generational trauma that has left oppressed Native tribes desperate to regain their culture.
These federal Indian boarding schools have impacted every Indigenous person I know.
Language revitalization and addressing high rates of substance abuse and mental health issues are top priority for the millions of Native Americans left to pick up the pieces. The federal boarding school system began winding down in the 1930s with the Indian Reorganization Act. It promoted Native self-determination and allowed more tribal governance in education. But some schools continued to operate for decades. Some government-operated boarding schools still exist today, though they operate with more respect for Native culture and input. Here to further this discussion is Denise Lajimodiere, a co-founder of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Denise, thanks so much for joining us tonight. So tell us, what does it feel like for the Native communities to finally hear this apology from a U.S. president?
Yes, it's a historic day, a very emotional day. My eyes are bloodshot from crying with boarding school survivors that I'm here with in Utah as we interview boarding school survivors all week. It's a validation of what they went through. I've been advocating for an apology for over a decade, so I'm very happy to heard what I consider a very sincere apology from the president and the federal government.
You know, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, made history as the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary. And she launched the investigation into these boarding schools back in 2021, shedding light on this very painful legacy. Explain to us how the impact of these schools still affect the Indigenous community.
All week, we've been interviewing boarding school survivors. Well, this is our 7th state that we've attended as the Boarding School Healing Coalition. I'm an oral historian with the Oral Historian Project. So I'm listening to stories that, you know, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of tears. They tell their story. They tell of the abuse. They tell of having to eat soap in their mouths because they spoke their language, and they break down and just sob. So we're still very much in what was just mentioned, the generational trauma. It was not that long ago. My parents and all of my grandparents were boarding school. So I'm of that generation that is experiencing intergenerational trauma.
Those oral histories are so valuable as you move forward. This apology is a big step, but it clearly needs to be backed up with action. What would the Native communities like to see happen next?
Well, I know there's a federal report that Deb Haaland came out with, so there's a lot of steps, and one of the steps was have an apology. I think another recommendation is a memorial for our boarding school survivors. history, this is part of letting America know what happened to Native people. So there's just a lot more steps. Passing the Truth and Healing Act, I think, is one of the next most important steps.
To help us understand what this moment, this recognition, means for the younger generation of Native Americans right now.
Yeah, I think it's a part of education. So many interviewers or reporters have said, we just heard about this 2 weeks ago, or we never heard about this. And someone said, you were written out of history. I said, we weren't written into history. So I think that so many of our boarding school survivors never talked about their boarding school experience. They were so traumatized. They didn't want to traumatize their children or grandchildren. So I think this is a chance to educate America, along with educating our own people, our own children, so that they understand why their parents parented them the way they did, why we are the way we are, why we have the high, suicide and diabetes, and all of those are come from the overarching issue of boarding school trauma.
Canada and other countries have taken steps like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Do you think that could be a good path here in the U.S. as well?
Well, absolutely. The Truth and Healing Act Commission, I think, will do just that. But we call it Truth and Healing. Canada is decades ahead of us in boarding school healing. For us here in America, it's only been maybe in the last 4 years since Kamloops happened. The national and international news hit about Kamloops and the unmarked graves. And our Canadian brothers and sisters said, you better look south because the same thing happened to us. So that's when the news media started becoming more interested. And it hit the national news here in the United States. We're just now starting truth telling. And then we need to know what that looks like as far as healing.
Well, hopefully this progress will continue to move forward. Denise Lajimodiere, thank you so much for your time tonight and for sharing your community story with us.